Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Ross Savage, your chairman, speaking, and welcome to our third IMPS Zoom presentation. Great to see you all out there this evening. Thank you for taking the time. Very pleased to welcome Alan Ede, who's our president, who this evening is going to talk on the Eagle Squadrons, 1940 to 42. This is a very interesting subject, which Alan knows in great depth and everything, so you shall be in for an interesting evening. So please sit back, relax, get your slippers on. Alan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Hope you've got your beers in hand, glasses of wine in hand, or glass of water in hand, and sitting comfortably. This is a talk that I started doing on the Eagle Squadrons, particularly the story of the 133 Squadron that was based at Biggin Hill in 1942. And I, as one of the volunteers at the Memorial Museum up at Biggin Hill, I started doing sort of 20-minute talks. So when it came to this talk, I researched further. So it's a little bit more extended than the 20 minutes that I normally do, with a bit more detail. So hopefully you won't find it too boring. The story of the Eagle Squadrons was just 1940 to 1942. That's when they ran, effectively 2 years. The first Eagle Squadron in September 40, and then they finished in the end of 42. Now, these were made up of American volunteers, all volunteers that joined the RAF prior to the Eagle Squadrons being formed and later. And prior to America joining the war, the World War II in December 1941, a number of American men and women had decided that they wanted to join the forces to fight Nazi Germany. They had various reasons for it. Some obviously came from families that had already suffered as a result of Hitler's campaigns, countries that were overtaken, Poland, Czechoslovakia, places like that. And these were second or third generations in America of people from those countries. So there was a grudge. There were also quite a number of Jewish people that were aware of the situation in Germany during the 1930s, and they also joined the either the American forces. But those that had pilot's licenses wanted to fly. During the 1930s, the growth in private aviation, and aviation generally, especially in America, just grew. And many men and women learnt to fly, saving their wages, so that taking local flying lessons at the flying clubs. And they used to do crop dusting, crop spraying, barn displays, stunt displays. Commercial pilots flying locally and sometimes joining the airlines. So there was an awful lot of men, particularly, but some women that had pilot's licenses by the end of the 30s. In 1939 alone, California had the highest number of qualified pilot licenses, but they were unemployed and they couldn't get work. So when the war was kicking off in 1939, these people decided that they wanted to fight and join active services. America, of course, wasn't partaking. It wasn't even recruiting particularly, although the US Army Air Corps were taking people. However, the limitations on getting into the United States Army Air Corps were quite tight. And the Canadian Air Force, the Royal Canadian Air Force, their entry conditions were slightly lower. For instance, all they wanted was a high school diploma. The applicants had to be between 20 and 31 years old. They had to have 20/40 vision, which could be correctable with goggle lenses, whereas the US Army Air Corps was strict on the 20/20. They had to have 300 hours of qualified flying. And so this was slightly easier to get in. Also, the Canadians weren't quite so fussed on marital status, whereas the US Army Air Corps, it was strict single men only. And obviously that was a route that the Americans thought they would go. A number started to move across the Canadian border, and they did it in various ways. The picture you're looking at the moment, the man on the right-hand side there, nearest to the propeller, is Colonel Charles Sweeney. And I'll tell you more about him in a minute. He was a man from Ohio from a wealthy family. He was a former soldier of fortune. He raised armies in different countries and fought in different countries. He was a complete soldier of fortune, quite a mercenary. But he got involved with a recruiting system, and I'll explain that in a little bit more in the detail. But as a result of which, and he's in RAF uniform now, because of his work, he was given an honorary command of 71 Squadron. But I'll explain that a little bit more later. The people that wanted to volunteer for the Air Forces, America had neutrality laws. So it was forbidden for American citizens to take up arms with a belligerent country, another belligerent country. So the difficulty was that it was effectively against the law for Americans to be fighting for someone else. But many of them made it across the Canadian border. Sometimes it was very surreptitiously creeping across, catching trains under various disguises. Some loaded up a pickup truck and put fishing rods and camping gear in the back and took their chance of driving across the Canadian border to see if they could join up with the Royal Canadian Air Force. The FBI and other agencies tracked them down, sometimes sent them back to America. Some were arrested, but made it through. A lot of them did. When they got through to the Canadian Air Force, they could either sign up for them or they could, if they wanted to, join the Royal Air Force. But the Canadian Air Force obviously chose them first. If they wanted to join the RAF, there were a couple of organisations that were set up to help recruit. The first of these, as I said before, was Charles Sweeney and his nephew, also Charles Sweeney. Charles Sweeney, without the colonel heading, was a wealthy businessman living in London. He was an American citizen living in London. He was quite a significant sportsman as well. He and the family and Colonel Charles Sweeney started recruiting. They initially started recruiting for the Finnish-Russian War, where Finland needed pilots. They started that. Finnish-Russian War didn't last 5 minutes, so they then moved on to the French War and tried to recruit for the French Air Force, which they were quite successful with. In the First World War, there was a squadron, a Lafayette squadron, that was mainly made up of Americans flying Spads in the First World War. And they thought we could do that again with the Second World War. However, the events of 1939 and into 1940 overtook them a little. So they were recruiting, and during the course of their recruiting, they managed to get 32 American volunteer pilots to Paris, and only six of those managed to get out before the Germans invaded France and Paris. The other organisation that were running at that time was led by Clayton Knight. Now, Clayton Knight was a famous American avian artist. He was also an ex-World War I pilot, and he was involved with Air Vice Marshal Billy Bishop, another Canadian World War I ace. And they set up the Clayton Knight Committee. The Clayton Knight Committee then processed thousands of applications. In fact, before December 1941, they'd actually recruited or processed 50,000 volunteers for either the Canadian Air Force or the RAF, of which they accepted 6,700 men for both those forces, including 92% of the future Eagles. It was quite a significant organisation, and they, as I say, they managed to get an awful lot of volunteers into the RAF. June 1940, Colonel Charles Sweeney and his nephew Bobby Sweeney were both in London at that time. They made approaches to the Air Ministry and also through to Winston Churchill to see if they could form what was called an American Defence Corps in the UK. They said that they've got loads of pilots that were willing to join it, but events of 1940 changed. The Air Ministry accepted what they said, and the sort of future of the Eagle Squadrons was based on that. As I say, Colonel Sweeney, as a result of his efforts there, was made honorary RAF commander. In Canada, those that got into the RAF or the Canadian Air Force, they did most of their training over in Canada. and they were flying these, which was the Miles Master 1, which was quite a good advanced trainer at that time. Once they qualified on that, they then were moved on to Hurricanes and to flying then real fighter aircraft, which they had at the time, Hurricane 1s mainly, before they got Hurricane 2s. If they were passed out, they became commissioned officers in the RAF. They wore the blues, had their RAF ranks, but to designate that they were Eagle Squadron or American pilots, they had that badge that we saw that was on their right and left shoulders, on their tunics and uniforms, which set them as Eagle Squadron American volunteers. But otherwise, they were wearing their normal RAF uniforms. In September 1940, the first of the Eagle Squadrons was formed, 71 Squadron at RAF Church Fenton in Yorkshire. And on the 19th of September, the first 3 pilots appeared at the squadron. The 3 that you can see there, that's Gene Tobin on the left-hand side, Vernon, otherwise known as Shorty Keogh in the middle, who was one of the smallest RAF pilots at the time, and Andy Maimdoff on the right-hand side. They were the 3 first ones. Now, they were 3 of the 6 that managed to escape from Paris before the Germans got there. They came over to England by boat. They were then joined up. They did some advanced training, and then they were posted to 609 Squadron down in Dorset. But as soon as the Eagle Squadron was formed, they were moved. So they were the first 3 pilots into 71 Squadron. The badge of the 71 Eagle Squadron was first from the Eries and depicts the American Eagle in the middle of the RAF, the badge there. So it was formed at Church Fenton, but very soon later it was moved to Curtin in Lindsey and declared operational in January 1941. The squadron became operational in January 71, and they were tasked with looking after the coastal convoys off the East Coast. The poor weather and lack of action during the 1941 made it difficult for the crews. They got a bit despondent. They expected to be thrown in the deep end, and they didn't. They were there. So discipline started to get worn away, and the CO had to put his foot down, tighten them up. And by the April 5th, they moved from Curtin in Lindsey to Marsham Heath near Ipswich. By this time, they were getting much more professional. They were mostly used on, as I say, on coastal convoys and looking after the area around the coast. Here you see some of 71 Squadron in front of their Hurricane. Second one in from the right-hand side is Gus Damon, and we've got a picture of him later. He was the first of the Eagles to win a DFC, but I'll show a picture of him later on. The next squadron that was formed was number 121 Squadron on the 14th of May 1941 at Curtin in Lindsey. The 71 Squadron already moved down to North Weald in Essex. So 121 was formed at Curtin in Lindsey under squadron leader Robin Powell, who was the CO, a British CO. They were flying worn-out Hurricane 1s at that time, and there was quite a few accidents with them. They were beyond serviceable. They'd come from other squadrons, and they were worn out, really. Quite a few accidents, a few men killed. They received Hurricane 2s in a short space of time, which made everything a little bit easier. And then they were again flying on the East Coast, protecting convoys in the area around Hull, which was coming under German attack. They then moved down to North Weald in December and replaced 71 Squadron. The continuous flow of Americans through the Clayton Knight system meant that more and more were becoming available. The commanding officers of many RAF squadrons were, so we say, hesitant to accept Americans into their squadrons. They'd seen how they had a different style. They had a different style of discipline and behaviour, a little bit boisterous at times, although the RAF were boisterous enough at times. So they were a bit reluctant. So they formed a third Eagle Squadron, which was 133 Squadron, and they were formed at RAF Coltishall on the 1st of August 1941. So they became the third of the Eagle Squadrons. They moved down to Duxford a short time later. Their squadron badge also had an eagle in it, and their motto was, "Let us to the battle." Under the leadership of the British CO, squadron leader G.A. Brown, he was formerly of 71 Squadron. They started to act quite efficiently. They were equipped with Hurricane 2Bs to start with, which were more effective. Andy Maimdoff who was one of the first three, as you saw. He was also moved down from 71 Squadron with his experience. He'd had Battle of Britain's experience with 609 Squadron before 71. They were all qualified by this time. He was moved down. He became B Flight Commander in 71 Squadron. He was also the first American Eagle to take an English bride who got married shortly later. But this was not a happy period for this squadron. It lost 8 pilots in a short space of time, 7 of them in flying accidents in just a couple of weeks. 4 of these were lost when the squadron was posted to Eglinton in Northern Ireland. They picked some rough weather to fly out there, and so 4 of them were lost crossing the North Sea in aircraft on the 8th of October 1941. Unfortunately, including the new bridegroom, Andy Maimdorf. He wasn't married for very long at all. 71 Squadron, this is Gus Damond, again, 71 Squadron. They received Spitfires at North Weald on the August 20th. These were Mark IIAs with 8 Browning 303 machine guns, but a month later, they were then equipped with the more powerful Spitfire 5B. These had 4 303 machine guns, but 2 20mm cannons fitted, which made them a much more efficient aircraft. 121 Squadron received their Spitfire 5Bs in November. 133 Squadron, they had 5Bs a little later, but September 42, they were the first and only RAF squadron to receive the Spitfire Mark IX, which was one of the best of the Spitfires at that time. At this time also, the last of the 3 original Eagles, Andy Maimdorf, has already been killed. Gene Tobin was lost. That was on the 7th of September during a fighter sweep over France. In October of 41, the Air Ministry confirmed 71 Squadron as the top RAF combat squadron. So they really had worked and performed so well during that period of time. And as I say, Gus Damond became the first RAF Eagle ace with 5 confirmed kills. There was a bit of dispute over this because Bill Dunn, who was one of his friends and contemporaries in the squadron, they were sort of not exactly racing to score, but it was a bit of a competition after a while as to who could shoot down 5 aircraft first and get the ace category. Gus Damond appeared to do it, and he was awarded the DFC and that title. However, when records were thoroughly examined later after the war, it was found that Bill Dunn had scored his 5th one a few minutes before Gus Damond. So correctly speaking, Bill Dunn was the first ace, but Gus Damond got the award. So the end of 1941, we come to December 7th, 1941, the attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor. And when this news started filtering through to the squadrons that this happened, they made representations to their COs initially, and then they started to go over their COs' heads to the Air Ministry to see if they could either transfer to the United States Army Air Force at this time, or could they be a squadron posted out to Singapore or the Far East to take on the Japanese. The Air Ministry, even Lee Mallory, declined their application. They said, we need you more here. And so the Eagle squadrons were stuck, but they would remain with the RAF for at least another 9 months. But they also needed these squadrons to be active into the more Southeast 11 group. 71 Squadron moved down to Martlesham Heath, which is near Ipswich. 121 took their place at North Weald, keeping in 11 group. And 133 was posted back from Eglinton in Northern Ireland and was posted to Curtin in Lindsey. So what were the pilots doing when they weren't fully operational? It was normal life for the pilots to work 7 to 10 days on flying duty in all sorts of weathers. They had to be on readiness or standing patrols. They would then have 2 to 3 days off duty. If they could afford it, they would head for the trains and down to London. Remembering, of course, that unlike the English or the British RAF pilots, they didn't have homes to go to. And in a similar form, like the Canadians and the Australians and the New Zealanders that were flying, they were effectively didn't have homes in the UK to go to when they were on leave or families to go to. So it was common practice for them to go where the so-called bright lights were. Not that they were very bright in 1940-41, but so they would catch trains down into London. One of the favourite spots of the Eagle Squadrons was the Regent's Palace and the Strand Palace hotels. If they could afford that, they got decent rates, or they sometimes got free rooms, because the hotels were quite pleased to have them and honoured to have them as foreign volunteer pilots. So they did quite well in that respect, and they've got many beers bought them. They would also frequent the Eagle Club, which was at 28 Charing Cross Road. Now, this was run by some of the women volunteer groups for Americans in British service. And here they could get a hamburger and chips. They could get a Coke. They'd also get free cigarettes, which was provided by tobacco companies, and they could pick up their mail. So it was a very popular club for the Eagle pilots. They also would they enjoyed some of the other restaurants around. Maxim's Chinese restaurant was a favourite, and as well as the Windmill Theatre, which was a popular venue for most of the servicemen. The reports of unruly behaviour started filtering from 133 Squadron at their time in Northern Ireland, started filtering through from the Air Ministry, and they were a little concerned as to how things were. They then promoted Carroll McAlpin here from 71 Squadron and made him B-Flight Commander in Flight Lieutenant in 133, and they felt that with his experience could get the squadron into shape. He knew what the problems were. When they went to Northern Ireland, they were in Eglinton, was not only in Northern Ireland in poorer weather sometimes, but the accommodation they were in were tented or old wooden huts. They weren't happy being there. They weren't happy being out of the action. And so that's why they kicked off a little bit over there. He knew why they were like that, but he had to get them straight, and he did so, and made top pilots of them. So 133 got up to scratch, as 71 had previously, and were very good. Their first success came on February 5th, 1942, when in very poor flying conditions, bad weather, thick cloud, they were scrambled to protect a convoy of ships going up the North Sea from the Channel along the coast, which the Germans were having a concerted effort to hit. And the squadron spent all their daylight hours fighting Junker and Dornier bombers with fighter escort, protecting the convoys. And as they did, none of the ships were seriously damaged, and certainly none of the convoys' ships were lost. This brought them praise from the Air Chief Marshal and a congratulatory telegram from the King. So they did well. They were also supplied then with their newer Spitfire 5Bs, so they were more than happy as a result of that. All three Eagle Squadrons were in action throughout this period of time now in 1942, and all through the winter months they were losing men and planes. On February 12th, a few days after the 133 were fighting over the Channel, 71 was scrambled in poor weather because of reports of 3 German pocket battleships heading from Brest, coming up the Channel. It had massive Luftwaffe escort of aircraft and was spotted initially, and all squadrons were put on standby and called out for it. 71 Squadrons was called out for that. And attacked the fighter escort as best as they could. But it was a hard stop. Germans were in force. And the result of that episode, the British lost 71 aircraft out of the 398 aircraft that were on that mission, including all 6 of the Swordfish torpedo aircraft that were assigned to try and sink or slow the ships down. All those crews were lost. Also in 1942, the RAF allowed volunteers from squadrons to transfer to Malta. Malta at that time was under heavy German attack. The Air Force was struggling. They've managed to get some Spitfires on carriers out there, but they needed volunteers. And a number of the Eagle pilots also volunteered for that. They thought the weather might be better down in the Mediterranean, and they took part flying Spitfires out of Malta, and some of them on the aircraft carriers that took the pilots and the crews there. At the beginning of May, the 3 Eagle Squadrons were then covering London and the South East, with 121 at North Weald. 71 moved to Debden, also in Essex, while on May the 3rd, 1942, 133 was posted to our local station at Biggin Hill. The picture there, you can see those that know Biggin Hill can almost, it's not changed an awful lot. The main entrance, the main gate, the guard room behind, the building's changed, but the environment is very much the same. They arrived at Biggin Hill for 4 months on wing sweeps and bomber escorts over France. And for the first time ever, the Stars and Stripes was hoisted above Biggin Hill. The men enjoyed their stay at Biggin on the Bump. They've settled into life on the hill, where they were also much nearer to the action. Unlike the Battle of Britain pilots who chose the White Hart at Braisted for their drinking hole, the Americans, the Eagles 133 Squadron, chose the Queen's Head in Down Village. And that's it on the left-hand side of the picture there. There's a room on the right of the front door in the Queen's Head that's the American room, and that has some pictures and some memorial articles from the American 133 that was there. Worth a visit and a beer if you're down that way. On the 4th of June, 133 Squadron provided cover for a commando raid, which was between Boulogne and Le Touquet. And on that same day, Matt McAlpin, the CO, was posted on a fundraising tour to the US for a number of weeks. And a certain Flight Lieutenant, Don Blakesley, became the temporary CO. He joined the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1940. He took his place. He was one of the finest pilots and finest leaders in the RAF at that time. A tall, handsome man. This is him in his Spitfire, and he became the squadron leader for that period of time, during which all 3 Eagle Squadrons took part in air cover for Operation Jubilee, which was the raid on Dieppe on the 19th of August 1942. Again, massive air cover for the 7,000 odd commandos and mainly made up of Canadian troops that landed, and we all know how it turned out, a disaster. But and the RAF provided huge air cover for it at that time. 133 moved temporarily down to Lymm airfield down on the Kent coast at that time with 401 Royal Canadian Air Force Squadron, both from Biggin Hill, so that they were nearer the coast to and to get to Dieppe. They put out 4 patrols over the coast, part of 76 RAF squadrons. 48 of them were Spitfire squadrons. 133 accounted for 5 enemy aircraft destroyed, 2 probables and 8 damaged. No losses to 133, but the Allies lost 106 aircraft during the Dieppe episode, Operation Jubilee. 64 of them were Spitfires. Blakesley led all 4 missions out of Lymm on that day, and he accounted for several enemy aircraft shot down. As I say, he was a popular and brilliant leader. So it came a bit of a shock to the troops to learn that he'd been busted from squadron leader back to flying officer. His offence was that the station commander at Lymm, I think it was at Lymm, could have been Biggin, but he spotted a female getting out of Blakesley's window late at night, and he was busted for entertaining female company in his quarters after hours. Unfortunately, it wasn't just one female getting out of his window. There was a second female climbing out of his window, both of them WAFs. Anyway, Blakesley was busted. He was posted back as a flying officer and given secondary duties of target tug flying and that sort of training, which was very unfortunate. The station commander, McAlpin, returned from his US tour at that time, assumed command. He'd now served in combat in all 3 of the Eagle squadrons, but Blakesley was temporarily grounded most of the time. After being rested at Martlesham Heath for a week, 133 returned to frontline service at Biggin Hill on the 1st of September, and they were now issued with the Spitfire Mark 9s. This is a 133 Squadron Spitfire at Biggin Hill, MD being their squadron code, and they were the first RAF and the only Eagle Squadron to use the Mark 9s. Unfortunately, it wasn't going to be for a very long time. So during 1942, the 8th US Army Air Force were building in the UK. They started sending aircraft and men over in the beginning of 1942, and by April, quite a number of aircraft and bomber squadrons were landing, with fighter escorts being sent over fighters were often sent on ships and unloaded at Liverpool and then dragged through the Mersey Tunnel through to as an assembly area where they were flown off to various squadrons. So the 8th Air Force were arriving. So the Eagles felt that it was only a matter of time, really, before they would be transferred to the United States Army Air Force, having initially requested it back in December 41. But the authorities decided that the formal date was going to be late September. September the 29th, 1942 was going to be the transfer date for the 3 Eagle squadrons into the 8th Air Force, and that was going to take part at RAF Debden. So there's been much discussion between the RAF and the Americans, the United States Army Air Force, as to how this was going to happen. When the RAF considered that they were going to lose 3 trained and expensively trained RAF squadrons of qualified men, experienced men, that was a little bit of a hard thought, but they had to let them go. They would also lose their aircraft, because the American fighters, replacement fighters, were not going to be supplied to them until early in March 1943, which would be the P-47 Thunderbolts. So they had to lose their Spitfires as well as their men. The British weren't quite so happy about that. Then there was the question of rank, how they were going to change over. All the Eagle pilots had to attend a US AAF board in London where they would be sworn in. They hadn't initially, when they joined the RAF, they hadn't had to give up their American citizenship, which was a major issue at the time, but they had to be sworn in as American pilots now. They had to attend tailors to be fitted out with their brown uniforms, although they would be wearing their RAF blues until the day of the transfer. The ranks had to be worked out. A RAF flying officer didn't have an equivalent rank in the United States Air Force, so they were promoted to second lieutenant. A flight lieutenant in the RAF would become a captain. A squadron leader would be a major, and a wing commander in the RAF would change to the equivalent of a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army Air Force with their equivalent ranks and badges. But one of the things that cropped up was that the Eagles had earned their RAF wings, which they proudly wore, and they were going to lose their RAF wings, and also they hadn't had the chance to qualify for their United States wings, which were the silver metal wings that the Americans had. And that was a point of discussion. In the end, that the Americans decided that they could wear their RAF wings, which they did, a smaller badge, which they wore on their right breast, and they would be issued with their silver American wings, which they wore correctly on the left breast as everybody else did. The big bonus was that they were going to be on the US Army payroll, which meant that their wages would be triple what they were getting in the RAF. So they were quite happy with that. The Americans initially had wanted the pilots to be spread across various squadrons because they obviously realized they were quite experienced with combat, whereas the American pilots were new to it. But the 3 Eagle squadrons wanted to stay together. So it was decided that they would form a fighter group and became the 4th fighter group. And I'll tell you a little bit more about them later. Here you see one of 133's Spitfires, still with the code on it, but it's now displaying the American stars on the wings and on the fuselage instead of the RAF roundel. And this would be the case until, as I say, in early 1943, when they would be re-equipped with Thunderbolts and then flying American aircraft. The Americans did use Spitfires in other fields. They had the photo reconnaissance version, the PR version of the Spitfire, which 1 or 2 American squadrons flew, and obviously the ones that they were flying out in the Middle East and Malta were also American squadrons flying properly marked Spitfires. So in the weeks preceding the transfer, as I say, they had to attend a board in London. They worked out their ranks and how they were going to be, and they got their strength. On one of the boards, Pete Peterson, who was the CO of 71 Squadron at that time and really one of the top pilots, highly recognised, and he went before the board, and one of the things he did was spoke to them about Blakesley. He said, we need Blakesley in the squadron, in the 4th fighter group, and General Hunter agreed, but Blakesley had to go through the ranks. He couldn't be reinstated back to his old rank, so over a week. 1 week he was one rank, the next week he was posted at another rank, and managed to get back to his full rank as squadron leader. So eventually he would join 4th Fighter Group at the end of the month. So moving on, in the weeks preceding this was a 133 was at Biggin Hill. They were engaged on fighter sweeps and escorts. By this time, the American bomber crews were learning the ropes. They were still very inexperienced, and 133 was engaged in bomber escorts of these B-17s. And when you read the pilot's accounts of it, you understand that they didn't only have to have the Messerschmitts to worry about and the Focke-Wulf 190s to worry about. They had the gunners, the trigger-happy gunners on the B-17s to worry about as well. So flying in amongst them to fight the Messerschmitts was just as hazardous as fighting the Messerschmitts, because the inexperienced gunners were just as likely to shoot the Spitfires down as well. But this was the last month or so after Dieppe in September, running up to the end of the month when they change over to the US Army Air Force. For 133 Squadron, however, the end of the month didn't finish very well. In fact, it was a total disaster and a tragedy and a black day for Fighter Command. There had been a mission that was planned for September. It was brought in for 133 Squadron to be involved early in September, but it kept getting put off because the weather was poor. And also the bomb group that they were going to be escorting had other problems. So it got delayed. Mac McAlpin, by this time the CO, he'd been sending his men up to London for their boards in 2s and 3s so that he could keep enough men back for this mission that was hovering around throughout September. But it kept, as I say, getting put off. On the 23rd of September, as time was running out, 6 days before the transfer, 133 was posted to Great Sandford, a satellite airfield that was near Debden over in Essex prior to the transfer. So they posted out of Biggin Hill. Mac McAlpin, 2 days later, was ordered to attend the board up in London because he was the last man. Everybody else had gone through the system, got their uniforms and were all equipped, but he was the last man. So he had to go up to London on the 25th of September. He briefed Flight Lieutenant Gordon Brettell, who was an English RAF pilot, former racing driver in the 1930s, to take over from him for the squadron should the mission be called in before he could get back. Unfortunately, the mission was called in on the following day, the 26th of September 1942. On the morning of the 26th, the mission came in that it was going to be on that day. The mission involved flying down, as you can see from the sketch that I've drawn here, from Great Sandford in Essex. It's about 200 miles down to Bolt Head, which is almost down on Devon there. And that was an airfield up on the cliffs at Bolt Head to refuel, have a briefing, and then they would take off from there when they were scrambled to meet the 97th Bomb Group of 18 flying fortresses from the 97th Bomb Group over the channel at 25,000 feet and escort them to bomb the town of Morlaix. Well, not particularly the town, which is on the Brest Peninsula down there, as you can see. Morlaix had a Focke-Wulf maintenance and assembly plant down there. I think they were predominantly the Focke-Wulf Condors, which were the big 4-engine planes that were a hazard to the shipping convoys approaching the coast, and also the rail yards that were nearby. So that was the mission. It shouldn't have been a difficult mission. These were the sort of mission that 133 had been doing for the last week. So they weren't too worried about it. But the day was poor. It was wet. It was low cloud. They flew down from Great Sandford down to Bolt Head, landed. They were late. They expected it to be recalled because of the poor weather, and they landed at Bolt Head. Not all of them attended the briefing. In fact, most of them didn't, because it was another, as they say, it's another routine. They weren't too worried. They knew what they had to do, and they didn't attend the briefing. But those that did attend the briefing were given the mission, and was explained to them that when the weather briefing came up, they were told that they would be facing a 35-knot headwind. In other words, a wind from the south at 35 knots into them. In fact, at 28,000 feet where they were going to be flying, it was a 100-knot tailwind. That meant 135 knot difference to disaster. They didn't know that. They flew down there with two other squadrons from Biggin Hill, 401 and 412 Canadian squadrons. So they had 3 squadrons for the escort of the planes. 133 were assigned on close cover, while the other 2 squadrons were on high, top and low cover. They were scrambled out from Bolt Head in the afternoon after refueling. There were problems with some of the refueling when they did get surrounded. It was a small airfield, and they took off. Unfortunately, 15 minutes out, they were over solid cloud. And shortly after, within 30 minutes, they were off the radar cover from Exeter, and they'd lost radio communication with Exeter control as well. They flew south, not realizing that their speed was a huge amount different to what they thought they were flying at. Their rendezvous point with the flying fortresses, they hovered and circled there for a few minutes, but in fact, they never saw them. They never saw the bombers on the way out, so they carried on south. When they did find the bombers, they were well over the Bay of Biscay. They'd travelled right across the Brest Peninsula without seeing it. They saw the bombers coming back. The bombers, in fact, also had been given the wrong weather. They'd travelled south. In fact, they'd almost reached the border with Spain at the Pyrenees before they realised that they'd overshot. They started coming back. The Spitfires then bolted into them and took up their positions, 133 on close escort and the other 2 as well. But because they were flying now into a huge headwind, their speed was reduced. They had to maintain close contact with the flying fortresses, who had dropped their bombs, by the way, over the Bay of Biscay. So they weren't going to do the raid any longer, but they had to escort them. So they had to adjust their speed and zigzag, as they referred to it, to keep back with the bombers. That was the mission. So they were heading north now. 2 of the pilots had been stood down at Bolt Head. I forgot to mention that. Don Gentle and Dusty Miller, they were spare pilots, so they stood down. But other than that, they had 12 Spitfires of the squadron. On the way out, one of the pilots, pilot officer Neville, had an engine problem on the flight out. He had to turn back. Brettle, who was the CO at the time, ordered pilot officer Beatty to go with him. So 2 of them turned back. Fortunately, they were now over the Brest Peninsula when Beatty, Neville went down to see if he could see land. He was shot down, and Beatty carried on flying back to the UK. He was the only man to return. The rest of the squadron, 133 squadron, were heading north. They couldn't see the ground, but through a break in the ground, they saw a rugged coastline. So the question was now, was this the coast of Cornwall, Devon, or was it something else? They also saw a large town through the gap in the cloud, but didn't recognise it at all. It was new ground to them because they'd been mostly over the east coast of the UK and the southeast. Brettle decided to, he said he was going to go down through the cloud and the hull and take a look. Unfortunately, his instructions weren't clear, and the rest of the squadron followed him down. And as they came down, they suddenly found that they were being fired at, and the flak was coming up heavily. And what they didn't realise, that they were actually coming down over the town of Brest, which was heavily defended by the German gunners, anti-aircraft, and coming under fire. They scattered. 6 of the Spitfires were shot down, 4 were killed. The remainder were running out of fuel rapidly. They were flying on fuel, and they had to come down any case. So 4 of them sort of crash landed in various places around the area, and 4 were captured that weren't killed. 4 were captured, and some of them were injured, taken to hospital. The 2 managed to force land a little bit further away and went into hiding, and they managed to make it back. The 2 of them got back to England, Bob Smith and Eric Dooley. They came back to England in March 1943. Brettle, the CO of 133 at that time, he was shot down, but he managed to get the plane down. He was seriously injured, head injuries and a few broken bones. He went to hospital, spent some time in hospital before he was then transferred to a prisoner of war camp, which was Staroglów 3 over in Poland, and joined 4 of the others that were also captured over there. He became a forger at Staroglów 3. He was one of the escapers of the Great Escape in 1944, but he was also one of the ones that were captured and one of the 50 that were later executed under Hitler's orders. As I say, only one of them managed to get back. Beatty, running out of fuel, landed near Kingsbridge on the cliffs at Kingsbridge, completely out of fuel, belly landed, slightly injured, but he was the only one of the squadron to return. By about 6 o'clock that evening, the Canadian squadrons came in. Most of them came in. 4 had actually ditched in the sea. They'd been running out of fuel as well. And 4 were lost, but the others either force landed at Bolt Head or nearby. Some again were injured. But the tragedy of the day was that the effectively 133 squadron, apart from BT, were lost, prisoner or killed. And not only had the RAF lost a complete squadron, they'd also lost their Spitfire Mark 9 squadron, which was handy for the Germans because the ones that weren't in bad condition when they crashed or force landed gave the Germans some insight as to the advances in the Mark 9 Spitfire. An immediate investigation took place. The RAF and the Air Ministry hushed it up because it was such a big disaster, one of the worst disasters for fighter command. But they found that the mission should have been abandoned. The weather was bad. It should have been scrapped. They should have had a recall. When the squadron flew out, and as soon as they lost radio communication, Exeter control should have recalled them. Unfortunately, the controllers at Exeter had no experience of large fighter wings, multiple wings. They'd had no experience of operating bombing missions, the particular controllers that were there. And so this was the crux of the problem. It was accepted, of course, that the weather or the Met forecast that they were given with the wind was the major contributory. The controllers were moved and new, better qualified ones were put in place. And that was how it went, really. Of course, back at Biggin Hill and Great Sanford, the ground crews and that had lost all their planes. They'd lost all their whole squadron, which was a big tragedy. The ground crew for 133 and the service staff were actually split up. They were sent to other squadrons because of the morale situation. So when they reformed effectively at Debden, there was new crews and ground crews sent in. So that was a significant factor. So it didn't just strike the squadron pilots, it struck the whole of the squadron staff. So that was on September 26th, a very bad day. So come the 29th at Debden, the formal transfer of the 3 Eagle squadrons took place at a wet Debden on the 29th of September. Only a few pilots were there from the old squadron. A few had been posted, so they had a couple more. On the picture that you see before you, the chap that's receiving his DFC from Eisenhower is Don Gentle. He later became CEO of the 4th Fighter Group. And on the right of the picture, also being awarded his DFC, is Don Blakesley. And both were 4th Fighter Group commanding officers. The review at Debden took place before Air Chief Marshal Sir Sholto Douglas, who praised the 3 squadrons and the service that they had been provided for the RAF and handed them over to their new boss, which is Major General Toohey Spatz, the Commander-in-Chief of the 8th Army Air Force. And that was at Debden on that day. There again is another picture a little while later, and that's Don Gentle on the left-hand side, who became top-scoring USA Air Force fighter pilot at that time. And that's his mount, this Mustang, which he'd named Shangri-La. Of the thousands who applied to join the RAF before America joined the war, only 244 were chosen as pilots. And at the time of the transfer into the 8th Air Force, only 34 of the original Eagles transferred to the 4th Fighter Group. In the 18 months of the 3 Eagle squadrons, they had destroyed 73 German aircraft, but had damaged many, many more. They'd earned 12 distinguished flying crosses, 1 distinguished service order, while 100 of their colleagues, the pilots, were killed, missing, or captured. Some of these now lay in this wonderful cemetery at Madingley up near Cambridge, the US Air Force, or the US Cemetery at Madingley, or they're in the US Cemetery section of Brookwood Cemetery in Surrey. Some of these are Eagle pilots, and on the walls of the missing and some of their names too. Madingley is worth a visit if you're going up the M11 and you've got a bit of time in hand. It's a beautiful cemetery. On the reredos at Biggin Hill, St George's RAF Memorial Chapel are the 13 names of 13 pilots from 13 states of the USA that formed 133 Squadron and were lost at their time flying out of Biggin Hill in 1942. The 4th Fighter Group, formed from the leftovers of these leaders, was an absolutely terrific fighter group. It was the highest scoring fighter group in the United States Army Air Force in World War II. It was the highest scoring fighter wing in the Korean War, and they also served with distinction in the Vietnam War. That was the 4th Fighter Group. Obviously, some of those pilots, very few of those pilots, served in Korea, but most of them were World War II pilots. They served with distinction and had supported the RAF in those days before America came in, and those very valuable days as squadrons. Those are the 3 badges for the 3 Eagle Squadrons. So they earned their respect throughout the RAF and have gone down in history, really. There's quite a few books. Anybody interested in reading more about the Eagle Squadrons, there's a few books that are worth reading. And some of those that can be obtained on Amazon, etc. So that's the Eagle Squadrons. Just 2 years, as I said before, September 1940 to 1942, end of 1942, when they transferred into the 8th Air Force. A lot of credit, a lot of excellent work, but losing men in the process as well. That's my story.